Felix Carter had spent the last 10 years fixing broken things because broken things made sense to him. Clocks especially. Old clocks had reasons for stopping. A damaged spring, dust in the gears, rust inside, tiny moving parts nobody noticed until time itself slowed down. People were harder. People left without warning. People smiled while falling apart. So Felix stayed downstairs in his little repair shop every night with tiny screwdrivers in his hands and music boxes ticking softly around him while the rest of the town moved on without him. Upstairs, his daughter Lena was singing badly to some pop song while brushing her teeth. Felix smiled despite himself as he carefully adjusted the hands of a silver pocket watch under the yellow desk lamp. It was nearly 9 at night, which meant Lena should already be in bed, but bedtime in their apartment had always been more of a negotiation than a rule. A second later, she appeared at the top of the stairs wearing oversized pajama pants covered in little stars. "You're still working. You're still awake." I came to say goodnight again because the first one wasn't dramatic enough. Felix snorted quietly. "Go to bed, troublemaker." Instead of leaving, Lena walked down into the shop and climbed onto the stool beside his workbench. She rested her chin on the table and watched him work. She always watched closely, like she was trying to understand how everything in the world fit together. "You fixed Mrs. Green's clock already." "Almost. You fix everything." Felix kept his eyes on the watch. "Not everything." Lena studied him for a second longer than most kids her age would. Then she reached into the pocket of her hoodie and placed a folded piece of paper beside his tools. "I drew something at school." Felix smiled softly. "Another dragon?" "No. Something important." "That sounds dangerous." "It probably is." He laughed quietly and unfolded the paper. It showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a building with books in the windows. One tall figure wore black. One wore green. The smallest one stood in the middle holding both their hands. Above them, Lena had written in uneven letters, "Some people look okay until you really look at them." Felix stared at the drawing for a moment. "What's this supposed to mean?" "It means you look lonely when you think nobody notices." Felix leaned back in his chair. "You're 10. You shouldn't say things like that." "You're 37. You should." Before he could answer, she hopped off the stool and headed back upstairs like she hadn't just punched directly through his chest. 3 afternoons a week, Lena waited for Felix after school at Hale and Finch Books, the small bookstore cafe 2 streets away from the repair shop. Felix trusted the place because Jackson Hale treated Lena like an actual person instead of just a noisy child taking up space. Jackson owned the bookstore. He was tall, usually dressed in dark sweaters with rolled sleeves, and always looked slightly distracted, like part of his brain lived somewhere far away. He remembered everyone's coffee order without writing it down. He also noticed things other people missed, like the tiny notes Lena left hidden inside returned books. The first one Jackson found was tucked into a poetry collection. "This book feels sad but nice." Another appeared inside a mystery novel. The old man didn't really want to solve the crime. He just didn't want to eat dinner alone. Jackson kept every note in a small tin box behind the counter. One snowy Thursday evening, Felix arrived almost 20 minutes late because a customer refused to stop talking about grandfather clocks. He pushed open the bookstore door carrying cold air and melted snow on his coat shoulders. Jackson looked up from behind the counter and paused. He had seen Felix before through the front windows picking Lena up, but never this close. The man looked exhausted. Dark coat, rough hands, tired eyes. But the second Lena saw him and ran across the bookstore yelling "Dad," something in his face completely changed. Warmth replaced exhaustion instantly. Jackson noticed that first. Felix crouched automatically to catch Lena as she launched herself into his arms. "You still awake?" "I had hot chocolate." "So technically no." Jackson laughed quietly behind the counter. Felix looked up for the first time. Their eyes met only briefly before Felix looked away again. "Sorry I'm late." "It's fine," Jackson said. She reorganized half the fantasy section while waiting. "I improved it," Lena corrected. Felix smiled under his breath. Jackson noticed that too. Over the next few weeks, Felix started staying a little longer whenever he came to pick Lena up. Sometimes it was just 5 minutes while Lena finished a drawing. Sometimes Jackson handed him coffee without asking, and they talked quietly while the bookstore emptied around them. Felix learned Jackson used to be a photographer before opening the shop. Jackson learned Felix repair clocks because his grandfather taught him when he was a kid. Neither of them talked much about the deeper parts yet, but something careful and quiet had started building between them anyway. Then Marcus ruined everything by deciding to help. Marcus worked at the repair shop 2 buildings down and had apparently spent months watching Felix slowly fall in love without realizing it. "You know the bookstore guy likes you, right?" Felix nearly dropped a screwdriver. "No, he doesn't. He absolutely does. We've had maybe 6 conversations." "Yeah, and during all 6, he looked at you like you personally invented sunsets." Felix rolled his eyes and went back to work. Marcus ignored him completely. "You should ask him out." "I'm not asking anyone out. You've been alone for 10 years. I haven't been alone. I have Lena." Marcus softened immediately. "That's not what I meant." But Felix knew exactly what he meant. That was the problem. 2 days later, Marcus conveniently informed him that Jackson was hosting a small after-hours poetry reading Friday night and had accidentally left an extra invitation on the counter. Felix knew he was being manipulated. Somehow he still agreed to go. Friday evening arrived faster than he wanted. Felix stood in front of his closet staring at 3 dark sweaters that all looked identical. Lena appeared behind him immediately. "You're nervous." "I'm choosing clothes." "You've changed shirts 4 times. That's called decision-making. It's called panicking." Felix pointed at the closet. "Pick one then." Lena instantly grabbed the dark green sweater. "This one." "Why?" "Because Jackson likes green." Felix froze. "How would you know that?" "He wears it all the time." That answer somehow made things worse. Felix finally put the sweater on while Lena watched with crossed arms like a tiny manager supervising an employee. Right before he left, she stopped him near the apartment door and slipped a folded note into his coat pocket. Felix caught her wrist gently. "What's this?" "Emergency instructions." "I'm serious." "So am I." He tried pulling the paper back out, but she slapped his hand away dramatically. "No, only read it if he feels important." Felix stared at her. "How do you even come up with these sentences?" "I'm gifted." He laughed despite himself and kissed the top of her head before leaving. Snow had started falling again by the time he reached the bookstore. Warm yellow light spilled across the sidewalk windows. Inside, only a few people remained scattered around the cafe with books and coffee cups. Felix almost turned around. In fact, he actually did turn halfway back toward the street before hearing the bookstore door open behind him. "You know," Jackson said quietly, "most people at least come inside before deciding to escape." Felix stopped. Jackson stood in the doorway wearing a charcoal sweater with rolled sleeves, one hand still holding the door open. Snowflakes clung to his dark hair. "I wasn't escaping," Felix muttered. Jackson smiled slightly. "Right." For a second, neither of them moved. Then Jackson's eyes dropped briefly toward Felix's coat pocket, where the corner of Lena's folded paper was sticking out slightly. Something warm crossed his expression instantly. "Your daughter planned this better than your friend did," he said softly. Felix blinked. "What?" Jackson nodded toward the pocket. "The note." Felix slowly pulled it out. The bookstore suddenly felt very quiet. He unfolded the paper carefully. Inside was another childish drawing. 2 men sitting across from each other with coffee cups between them. A little girl stood in the middle holding both their hands with an enormous smile on her face. Underneath, Lena had written, "Be kind to him. He looks lonely when he's alone." Felix stopped breathing for a second. Jackson looked away politely, pretending not to watch his reaction. But Felix could feel the quiet understanding standing between them anyway. "She leaves notes in books, too," Jackson admitted softly after a moment. Felix looked up sharply. "What?" Jackson laughed under his breath. "I found 6 of them already." "Oh my God." She's surprisingly good at emotional damage. Felix covered his face briefly with one hand, embarrassed and overwhelmed all at once. Jackson stepped closer carefully, not enough to crowd him, just enough to make the distance smaller. She talks about you a lot, Jackson said. Mostly about how you pretend you're fine when you're tired. Felix looked back down at the drawing in his hands. No one had said something that gentle to him in a very long time. Jackson spoke again, quieter this time. For what it's worth, I don't think she's wrong. Felix lifted his eyes slowly. And for the first time in 10 years, standing in the warm light of a bookstore with snow falling outside and his daughter's drawing trembling slightly in his hands, Felix realized he was suddenly terrified by how badly he wanted to stay. Felix told himself he was only stopping by the bookstore because Lena liked it there. That explanation worked for exactly 4 days before Marcus caught him leaving the repair shop early for the third time that week. You know, normal people just admit they like someone, Marcus said while reorganizing a drawer full of watch straps. Felix didn't even look up. I'm picking up my daughter. With coffee in your hand and your good coat on. It's cold outside. Marcus grinned. Sure. The annoying part was that Felix knew Marcus was right. Something had changed after the night of the poetry reading. Not dramatically. Nothing between him and Jackson had actually been defined. But suddenly the bookstore had started feeling less like a place Lena waited after school and more like somewhere Felix wanted to be. The problem was that wanting things had become dangerous to him a long time ago. That Friday evening, Felix walked into Hale and Finch with snow melting on his shoulders and immediately noticed the old wall clock above the cafe counter had stopped again. Jackson noticed him noticing it. Don't say it. Felix set his gloves on the counter. It's 6 minutes behind. It's decorative. It's broken. Jackson leaned against the espresso machine with a tired smile. You repair clocks for a living. I assume all clocks look broken to you. Felix stepped onto the small ladder beside the counter automatically. This one is actually broken. Jackson watched him remove the clock from the wall carefully, his sleeves pulling slightly up his forearms while he worked. Lena sat nearby, drawing with colored pencils and watching both of them with the expression of someone witnessing a very slow-moving romance and trying not to scream about it. You know, Jackson said casually, most people flirt by buying coffee. Felix glanced down from the ladder. This is flirting? You're fixing my clock for free. That's pity. That hurts my feelings. Lena looked up from her drawing. Dad likes fixing things when he cares about them. The silence afterward was immediate. Felix nearly dropped the screwdriver in his hand. Lena, what? It's true. Jackson bit back a smile behind his coffee cup. Over the next few weeks, routines formed naturally around the three of them. Felix would close the repair shop around 6, pick up Lena from school, and somehow end up at the bookstore almost every evening. Sometimes they stayed only 20 minutes. Sometimes they stayed until Jackson locked the doors for the night. The strange part was how easy it felt. Felix had expected awkwardness, effort, long silences that felt uncomfortable. Instead, he found himself sitting across from Jackson after closing time talking about stupid things that somehow didn't feel stupid at all, like which customers secretly rearranged bookshelves, or why Lena believed all raisins were betrayal grapes, or how Jackson once got stranded in Iceland for 2 days because he chased the perfect photograph during a snowstorm. You actually did that? Felix asked. Jackson shrugged. I was 24 and dramatic. You're still dramatic. That's fair. Lena usually fell asleep on one of the bookstore couches during those late evenings, curled under blankets while soft jazz played through the speakers. Felix started noticing little things about Jackson during those quiet hours. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when stressed. The way he remembered every regular customer's favorite drink. The way he smiled differently at Lena than he did at adults, softer somehow. And the loneliness. That was the part Felix understood best because he recognized it immediately. One night, a heavy storm hit town just before closing. Rain hammered against the bookstore windows while thunder shook the old building hard enough to rattle shelves. Lena had already fallen asleep upstairs in the reading loft, exhausted after spending 2 straight hours making paper snowflakes for absolutely no reason. Jackson locked the front door and sighed. Guess nobody else is coming tonight. Felix looked outside. Roads are flooding already. You should probably wait until it calms down. Normally Felix would have left anyway. 10 years ago, he would have preferred driving through a hurricane over staying somewhere he didn't fully understand emotionally. But tonight he stayed. Around 11, the power suddenly cut out. The bookstore dropped into darkness, except for faint storm light through the windows. A second later, Lena's sleepy voice floated down from upstairs. "Did we die?" Jackson laughed softly somewhere near the counter. "Not yet." Felix used his phone flashlight while Jackson found candles in a drawer behind the cafe register. Within minutes, warm, flickering light filled the bookstore, reflecting across shelves and old wooden floors. It felt strangely intimate. Too intimate. Lena climbed down from the loft, wrapped completely in a blanket like a tiny, exhausted ghost. "This is actually kind of cool." Jackson handed her a mug of hot chocolate. "You say that because you're not paying the electric bill." They ended up sitting together on the floor near the cafe counter because the candles gave off more warmth there. Lena drew quietly between them while Jackson and Felix talked in low voices over coffee. At some point, Felix realized he hadn't checked the time in over an hour. That almost never happened. Jackson stretched his legs out carefully beside him. "You know something weird?" "What?" "I think this is the most relaxed I've seen you." Felix stared into his coffee. "I'm relaxed." Jackson gave him a look. "Fine," Felix admitted. "Maybe slightly less tense than usual." High praise. Thunder cracked loudly overhead. Lena didn't look up from her drawing when she spoke. "Dad gets quiet when he's happy." Felix closed his eyes briefly. "You really enjoy emotionally humiliating me in public." "You're welcome." Jackson laughed harder this time, head dropping forward slightly. Felix looked at him without meaning to. The candlelight softened everything about Jackson's face. The sharpness disappeared when he laughed like that. For a second, Felix forgot how to breathe properly. Then Jackson looked back at him, and neither of them looked away. The room suddenly felt much smaller. Lena slowly lifted her hot chocolate with the expression of someone watching live television drama unfold in real time. Jackson spoke first, quieter now. "You're staring." Felix swallowed. "You don't sound sorry." That landed somewhere dangerous. The storm outside seemed farther away now. Felix became painfully aware of how close they were sitting. Jackson's arm brushed as lightly every time either of them moved. Then Lena spoke again, without looking up from her sketchbook. "If you already miss someone when they leave," she asked casually, "doesn't that mean you love them?" Complete silence. Felix actually felt his heartbeat stumble. Jackson looked at Lena first, then slowly toward Felix. Neither answered. Lena nodded to herself like the silence had already confirmed everything she needed to know. About 20 minutes later, she fell asleep against Felix's side, still holding a colored pencil. Jackson lowered his voice automatically. "She does that a lot." "Falls asleep mid-chaos?" "Constantly." Jackson smiled softly at Lena for a moment before standing up. "I'll grab another blanket." Felix watched him disappear into the back storage room. And suddenly everything inside him felt wrong. Not bad, just terrifyingly real. Because this no longer felt like casual coffee or harmless conversations. Somewhere between the bookstore nights and Lena's drawings and Jackson remembering exactly how he took his coffee, Felix had started wanting things again. A future. Warmth. Someone staying. That realization hit hard enough to make panic rise instantly behind his ribs. Jackson returned carrying the blanket, stopping when he noticed Felix standing now. "You okay?" Felix grabbed his coat too quickly. "I should get Lena home." Jackson's expression changed immediately. Hurt flashed there before he hit it. "Right. Of course." Felix hated himself for that look. He carefully lifted Lena into his arms while Jackson quietly unlocked the front door for them. Rain still poured outside. At the doorway, Felix stopped. Jackson stood close enough that Felix could see exhaustion beneath his calm expression now. For one dangerous second, Felix almost leaned forward, almost kissed him. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. Instead, he stepped back. "Good night," he said too fast. Then he walked out into the storm before Jackson could answer. Felix avoided Hale and Finch books for 6 straight days after the storm. He told himself it was because work had become busy before Christmas. That excuse might have sounded believable if he hadn't spent half those days staring at his phone whenever Jackson's name appeared on the screen. The messages themselves were harmless. "Hope you got home safe. Lena left her scarf here." The wall clock stopped again out of spite. Felix answered every text hours late and as briefly as possible. Jackson eventually stopped texting first. That somehow felt worse. Lena noticed the change almost immediately. By the third evening, she stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Felix cook pasta with the exhausted expression of a child whose parent was clearly making terrible decisions. "You're being weird again." Felix kept stirring the sauce. "I'm always weird." "No, this is the sad weird." "I'm fine. You stopped going to the bookstore." "I've been busy." "You cleaned the same clock 3 times yesterday." Felix glanced at her sharply. "Were you spying on me?" "I live here." "It's not spying." She crossed her arms. "Did something happen with Jackson?" The question landed too directly. Felix set the spoon down harder than necessary. "Nothing happened." "That's definitely not true." Before Felix could answer, Lena grabbed her backpack and disappeared into her room. A second later, he heard music blasting through the wall loud enough to communicate exactly how offended she felt. Felix leaned both hands against the kitchen counter and closed his eyes. 10 years. 10 years of carefully controlling his life so nothing could hurt him deeply again. And somehow, one quiet man in a bookstore had wrecked the entire system in less than a month. The truth was simple and embarrassing. Felix had almost kissed Jackson, and the moment he realized how badly he wanted to, fear hit him like cold water. Not fear of Jackson. Fear of losing him. Fear of building something real and watching it disappear later. Fear of Lena getting attached to someone who might eventually leave. Those fears had shaped his entire adult life. Loving people meant risking the exact kind of pain Felix had spent 10 years surviving. 3 days later, Lena returned from school quieter than usual. She barely touched dinner and disappeared upstairs immediately afterward. Felix assumed she was still annoyed with him until he noticed her bedroom light remained off for nearly an hour. He knocked softly and opened the door a crack. Lena sat on the floor beside her bed, hugging her knees, sketchbook lying closed beside her. "Hey," Felix said gently. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. That's my line." She didn't smile. That worried him instantly. Felix sat down beside her carefully. After a long silence, Lena finally spoke in a small voice. "Is Jackson leaving?" Felix frowned. "What?" "I heard him talking on the phone today." Her eyes stayed fixed on the carpet. "He said maybe you should leave before things got harder." Felix felt something tighten sharply in his chest. "You were at the bookstore today?" Lena nodded. "I forgot my sketchbook there yesterday." She swallowed hard. "He didn't know I heard." Felix understood immediately. Chicago. The photography offer. Jackson had mentioned it briefly once weeks ago, but never again. Felix had assumed he turned it down already. Apparently not. "Lena, he's leaving because of us, isn't he?" The heartbreak in her voice hit harder than Felix expected. He pulled her gently against his side, automatically. No, sweetheart. You don't know that." "But what if I do?" she whispered. "Everybody leaves eventually." Felix froze. Children repeated what they learned from the adults around them. Hearing his own fear come back through Lena's voice felt like being punched directly in the ribs. He held her tighter without thinking. "Jackson cares about you a lot. That makes it worse." Felix had no answer for that. The winter festival arrived 2 nights later, covering the entire downtown district in lights, music, and crowded sidewalks full of families drinking hot cider. Felix almost canceled on going when Lena barely spoke during breakfast, but she insisted she wanted to attend anyway. Halfway through the evening, he realized she hadn't smiled once. The festival was packed. Christmas music echoed through the streets while snow drifted lazily through glowing lights overhead. Felix kept one hand on Lena's shoulder as they moved through the crowd. Then he saw Jackson standing near the bookstore entrance helping customers carry boxes inside. For a second, everything stopped. Jackson looked up at exactly the same moment. The expression crossing his face wasn't anger. That would have been easier. It was relief first, then hesitation, then something sadder, carefully hidden underneath. Felix hated himself immediately. Lena noticed Jackson too. Her entire body stiffened. Before Felix could say anything, she quietly slipped away into the moving crowd. It took Felix 2 full seconds to realize she was gone. Then panic hit instantly. Lena, no answer. Felix spun around sharply, heart slamming against his ribs. Crowds moved everywhere around him. Children in winter coats. Families laughing. Lights flashing. No Lena. Lena, Jackson reached him almost immediately. What happened? She was right here. Fear changed everything about Felix's face so quickly that Jackson grabbed his arm without hesitation. We'll find her. They split up through the festival streets, calling her name. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Snow started falling harder. Felix checked every booth, every alley, every cafe entrance. His breathing became uneven. Images he tried not to think about for years started crashing back violently all at once. Hospitals. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Losing people faster than he could hold on to them. Jackson found him near the frozen fountain almost an hour later. She's not at the bookstore. Felix looked wrecked now, eyes red from panic and cold. I can't lose her. You won't. You don't know that. Jackson stepped closer. Felix, I spent 10 years making sure nothing could happen to her. His voice cracked roughly. Nothing. Jackson stared at him for one awful second before understanding the deeper meaning beneath the words. Felix wasn't only talking about tonight. Then Jackson suddenly stopped moving. Wait. What? The old bookstore. Felix blinked. What? On Mercer Street. The one that closed last year. Jackson was already turning. Lena told me once she likes it because it still smells like books inside. They ran through the snow. The abandoned bookstore sat dark between two closed restaurants near the edge of downtown. Jackson shoved the unlocked door open first. Cold air rushed out immediately. And there she was. Lena sat curled inside an old reading corner wrapped in her coat, sketchbook clutched tightly against her chest. Tears streaked her face the second she looked up and saw them. Felix crossed the room instantly and dropped to his knees in front of her. Jesus Christ, Lena. She burst into tears immediately. Felix pulled her into his arms so fast he almost knocked over the chair beside them. He held her tightly while she cried against his shoulder. I'm sorry, she whispered brokenly. I didn't want him to disappear. The words shattered the room open completely. Felix closed his eyes hard. Jackson looked away briefly like he physically couldn't handle hearing that sentence out loud. Eventually, they got Lena settled to sleep in the back seat of Felix's truck beneath 3 blankets and Jackson's coat. Snow covered the windshield while soft music played quietly through the speakers. Outside, the streets had gone almost silent. Felix stood beside the truck staring down at the snow beneath his boots. Jackson stayed a few feet away, giving him space. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Felix laughed once under his breath. Exhausted and miserable. I really screwed this up. Jackson looked at him carefully. You got scared. That's not an excuse. No. Jackson shoved his freezing hands deeper into his coat pockets. But it's true. Felix looked toward the sleeping shape of Lena inside the truck. She heard you talking about leaving. Jackson sighed softly. Chicago. You were considering it. I was considering running before this became something I couldn't walk away from. Felix looked up sharply at that. Jackson met his eyes fully now. You're not the only person scared here. Snow drifted slowly between them. Felix spoke quietly after a long silence. 10 years ago, I lost someone I thought I'd spend my whole life with. After that, everything became about survival. Lena, work, routine. I built my entire life around things staying manageable. He swallowed roughly. Then you showed up, and suddenly nothing feels manageable anymore. Jackson's expression softened painfully. Felix laughed again, quieter this time. The worst part is I don't even want it to. For a second, neither moved. Then Jackson stepped forward slowly and grabbed the front of Felix's coat gently in both hands. The kiss wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed or desperate. It was careful. Cold air. Snowflakes melting against skin. Two exhausted men finally stopping their own retreat at the exact same time. Felix kissed him back immediately. And the second he did, something inside him finally broke open. When they pulled apart, Felix lowered his forehead against Jackson's shoulder and laughed once shakily before tears hit him without warning. Real tears. The kind he hadn't allowed himself in years. Jackson wrapped both arms around him automatically and held on tight while snow fell silently around them. Neither of them let go first. The first night Jackson stayed over, neither of them officially acknowledged it was happening. Lena fell asleep halfway through a movie with her head in Jackson's lap, and her socks, somehow, missing despite the fact she had definitely been wearing them an hour earlier. Felix carried her to bed while Jackson cleaned up empty popcorn bowls in the kitchen downstairs. By the time Felix came back, Jackson was standing near the apartment window, pulling on his coat. "You don't have to leave," Felix said before he could stop himself. Jackson looked surprised for only a second. Then something soft crossed his face. "You sure?" Felix nodded once. "Yeah." Jackson stayed. That became another routine after that. Quietly at first, then naturally. Some mornings Felix woke up to the smell of coffee already brewing downstairs because Jackson had opened the bookstore early. Some nights Jackson fell asleep on the couch upstairs while Lena used his shoulder as a pillow and claimed she was not tired at all seconds before passing out completely. The apartment changed slowly after Jackson became part of it. Felix noticed it in little things first. Music playing while he worked downstairs instead of silence. Extra mugs beside the sink. Someone laughing in the kitchen while he repaired clocks late at night. The strange feeling of coming home and not feeling alone immediately. Lena noticed it too. "You smile more now," she announced one evening while sitting on the repair shop counter, swinging her legs. Felix glanced up from the music box he was fixing. "Doi." "Yeah, it's kind of weird." "Thank you. You also sleep sometimes now." "That sounds fake." "It's not fake. I checked." Jackson nearly choked on his coffee laughing. A week later, Lena secretly changed Felix's phone wallpaper to a blurry photo she had taken of him and Jackson carrying coffee through the snow together. Felix discovered it during work the next morning while Marcus stood beside him holding a wrench. Marcus stared at the screen, then at Felix's face, then back at the screen. "Oh my God, you look happy." Felix immediately locked the phone. "Mind your business." "That is my business. I suffered through 10 years of your emotional constipation." Felix rolled his eyes so hard it hurt. Meanwhile, Jackson still hadn't answered Chicago. Felix knew because he occasionally caught him staring at the unanswered emails late at night after thinking everyone else had gone to sleep. Jackson never talked about it directly, but Felix understood the fear underneath it now. Chicago wasn't really about photography anymore. It was about whether Jackson believed he was allowed to build a life here instead. One snowy Sunday afternoon, Jackson finally invited Felix and Lena upstairs above the bookstore, where he kept old photography equipment and hundreds of undeveloped prints stacked in dusty boxes. Lena disappeared instantly after spotting a vintage Polaroid camera, while Felix wandered slowly through shelves of photographs leaning against the walls. Landscapes, cities, oceans, mountains, faces from countries Felix had never visited. Then he noticed something different. Newer photographs. One showed Lena asleep inside the bookstore reading corner with crayons scattered around her. Another captured Felix standing outside the repair shop under falling snow, looking distracted and tired and strangely beautiful in a way Felix had never imagined himself looking. There were dozens. Jackson froze when he realized what Felix was holding. "I can explain." Felix looked up slowly. "You've been photographing us?" Jackson rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "That sounds creepier when you say it out loud." "How long?" "A while." Felix continued flipping carefully through the photographs. Most of them weren't posed at all. They were moments. Lena laughing with hot chocolate on her nose. Felix asleep at his workbench under warm yellow light. The three of them reflected together in the bookstore windows during rain. "You see things nobody else notices," Felix said quietly. Jackson looked down for a second. That's kind of the problem. Then Felix found the final photograph. He stopped moving completely. It showed him asleep on the couch upstairs with Lena curled against his chest while morning sunlight spilled across the blankets. Jackson must have taken it from the hallway because neither of them had noticed. Underneath, written in small black ink, "The moment I stopped feeling alone." Felix stared at the words for a long time without speaking. Jackson suddenly looked nervous, which Felix realized was rare. "You don't have to say anything." Felix crossed the room instead and kissed him before he could keep talking. Slow, warm, familiar now instead of uncertain. When they pulled apart, Jackson rested his forehead lightly against Felix's. "I think I'm falling in love with you in a way that's becoming extremely inconvenient." Felix laughed softly. "Good. Me too." 3 nights later, Jackson finally answered Chicago. He turned it down, but not before Felix nearly started an argument over it. "You shouldn't stay because you're afraid to leave," Felix told him firmly while they closed the bookstore together after midnight. Jackson leaned against the shelf beside him. "And what if I stay because I already know where I want to be?" Felix opened his mouth, closed it again. That answer stayed with him the entire night. Winter slowly softened towards spring after that. Jackson opened a small photography corner inside the bookstore cafe, displaying framed prints between shelves and coffee tables. Customers loved it immediately. Lena appointed herself assistant curator despite having absolutely no qualifications besides confidence. One evening after closing, Felix remained downstairs alone in the repair shop, long after everyone else went upstairs. Jackson eventually found him sitting quietly at his workbench, staring at an old brass clock resting in pieces beneath the lamp. Jackson recognized it instantly. "That's the one you never touch." Felix nodded slowly. The clock had belonged to the man Felix lost 10 years earlier. He had kept it all this time, but never repaired it. Every attempt ended the same way. Hands shaking too badly to continue. Until tonight. "I think I'm ready," Felix admitted quietly. Jackson said nothing. He simply pulled up a chair beside him and stayed there while Felix worked. An hour passed. Then 2. Tiny gears clicked softly beneath careful hands. Springs tightened. Dust cleared away piece by piece. Finally, the old clock started ticking again. The sound filled the quiet repair shop immediately. Felix stared at it almost in disbelief. "I thought this thing was broken forever," he whispered. Jackson stepped behind him slowly and wrapped both arms gently around his waist. Then he pressed a soft kiss against Felix's temple. "Some things just need time," he said. Felix closed his eyes briefly and leaned back against him. 1 year later, the wall between the bookstore and repair shop was knocked open and replaced with a wide archway connecting both businesses together. Customers wandered freely between coffee, books, clocks, and photographs while jazz music played softly through the combined space. Near the register, Lena stood on a chair, taping up a brand new drawing. 3 figures, one in black, one in green, one smiling between them holding both their hands. Above the little bookstore, she had written carefully in bright blue marker, "Nobody here is lonely anymore." Jackson walked over carrying coffee while Felix locked the front door for the night. Lena grinned proudly at all of them from the chair. Felix looked at the drawing, then at Jackson, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the future no longer felt frightening. It finally felt like home. Sometimes love doesn't arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes quietly through a bookstore door, a child's drawing, or the simple choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Felix spent 10 years believing survival was enough, until Lena and Jackson reminded him that being loved and being safe did not have to be opposites. In the end, it wasn't grand gestures that healed them. It was kindness, patience, and the courage to let someone stand beside you again. Thank you so much for listening to this